It is a truism of studies of politics, of society, of psychology, that the most difficult decisions to be made are those where the costs are short-term and immediate, but the benefits are deferred or long-term. Those are the most difficult decisions to get people to make. It's sort of like asking somebody who's just been hired at minimum wage to start putting away money for their retirement. When they're 22 years old, they have no concept of what that means, and it's too painful to take action. Politicians, by definition, political actors, are short-term oriented. They have term limits, they can be punished by other actors, and they deal in short-term consequences. It is even more difficult if the decisions that need to be taken are collective ones. They're not simply determined by an individual, but they require collective commitment, not just passive participation, active commitment, as well as, of course, some costs. And so it is with climate change, or more properly addressed, climate change action. Climate change is happening whether we like it or not. And so we see humanity's most recent effort in Paris to address, through the Framework Convention on Climate Change, sponsored by the United Nations, an attempt to achieve a reasonable goal of holding the increase in temperature globally to 2 degrees Celsius. There are a variety of ways that people have suggested that we might do so, mitigating the effects, reducing or even eliminating carbon emissions, capturing carbon emissions, which means you don't have to actually stop them from being produced, you somehow capture them, increasing the rate and the range and capacity of natural eliminators. There's a whole range of things. And humanity, as it's represented at Paris, trying to come up with an effective, equitable, enforceable, long-lasting way to deal with what appears to be a fairly modest goal. But the ecosphere is not waiting. Can I see the first slide, please? Maybe. As you can see from this slide, global temperatures have steadily increased since the the period of industrial development, roughly the end of the 19th century, whether measured by individual average or by 5-year averages. As you can see on this, there you go, on this chart. There have been occasional dips, but the trend upward is inexorable. Next slide, please. Even if we look at just the last 2 decades, and trust me, the slide does do that, what you see is, this was a clever slide. It was a clever piece of data manipulation. It took, there's the one that links average temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations from about the same period. Any political scientist, any statistician would see an extremely high correlation here. Next slide, if possible. There we go. This is a very clever bit of data presented that takes the month of, it's a random selection of months which happen to be months when the UN, one or another UN conferences occurred, and measures it against the 20th century average for the last 20 years. As you can see, not a single one of those months were at or much less below the average. Most were above, and in recent years, most were way above. There simply is overwhelming evidence that the atmosphere isn't waiting for us to act. You may have noticed on my very first slide, don't go back to it, that today's temperature in Pittsburgh, which is a northern hemisphere country, at noon was 57 degrees on December 11th, 2015. 2014 was the warmest year on record. This October was the warmest October ever measured, and the warmest month ever measured compared to average. 2014 was a record year. 2015 is on pace to surpass it. Next slide, please. If we look at the consequences of acting, the goal that I described to you, that most everybody in this room is aware of 2 degrees centigrade, is fairly modest, but we are not achieving it. The consequences of no action, doing nothing, to the end of the century, gives us 4.5 degrees. Current trends, modest that they are, at least is less than that. And then you see the green pathway. In other words, the world is simply not going to wait for its political actors to take action. A recent article in Time said, it turns out that while plenty of countries want to fix climate change, they don't want to be legally bound to do so. To have a 50-50 shot at keeping the global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, CO2 levels must stop growing by 2020, which is only 2.5 years away, 3.5 years away, and then halved by 2050. We are not remotely on track. It is our fate that the Earth on which we live and the humans with whom we inhabit it is governed by roughly 200 different national entities. They each make their own decisions, with a few exceptions, most notably in the EU, and they will decide on whether or not we successfully grapple with this issue. They have a Rubik's Cube kind of a problem, which is that climate change and its effects does not respect boundaries, but the decisions are made within boundaries. And they have to figure out how to handle it. Can they do it? Can they accomplish those goals? What progress have they made to this point? And what are the prospects? Fortunately, I don't have to answer those questions. But we have put together an outstanding panel of people who will address them. And I thank them in advance for their participation. Thomas Carlin comes to us from the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, where he focuses in his work on European energy policy. He has experience in the French administration and in academics. He has a master's in European political administrative studies from the College of Europe. Leah Stokes joins us from California. We thank you for getting up early, where she is assistant professor of the Department of Political Science at University of California, Santa Barbara. Her PhD is from MIT, and she has written on, among other things, electoral backlash against climate policy, a natural experiment on retrospective voting and local resistance to public policy, a subject which I hope we will get into. Will Burns is co-director of the Format for Climate Geoengineering Assessment, which is a scholarly initiative of the American University, and he's a scholar in residence at the American School of Service at American University. He has been involved in this policy in a number of organizations. He holds a PhD in international environmental law from the University of Wales, Cardiff School of Law. My colleague on my right, Michael Acklin, is assistant professor in political science here at the University of Pittsburgh. His PhD is from New York University, and he works on, among other things, the consequences of policies devoted to the environment. The most recent publication is Re-Exploring the Trade and Environment Nexus Through the Diffusion of Pollution, forthcoming in Environmental and Resource Economics. And I'm happy to say he is chair and organizing a conference for us, which will take place in the spring on climate and energy and the nexus there too. So with that introduction, I would like to ask my panelists, actually I'm going to begin with you, Will, before we get to what's happened in Paris most recently, and by that I mean literally hours ago, I'd like you to address the question of the political atmosphere leading up to this conference. Was there a reason to be more hopeful, or was there a reason to simply expect more of the same? Was it different in any way before Paris?
The political atmosphere was much more propitious for this meeting than, for example, Copenhagen in 2009, and that was true for a number of reasons. For one, I think that the science of climate change has become more urgent. It's become increasingly clear that that there are incredibly serious manifestations that occur when temperatures increase by certainly two degrees Celsius, and increasingly we believe 1.5 degrees Celsius. Second of all, we've made dramatic strides in recent years in terms of bringing down the costs associated with renewable energy resources, and we've made progress in storage, in grid development, and so the aggregate costs of being able to decarbonize the economy within a reasonable period of time in this century has become much more reasonable. And I think probably the third development, and in some ways it's paradoxical, is the movement away from a top-down approach in which the regime itself has established the objectives and require the parties to do so, to more of a bottom-up approach where the parties are making pledges as to what they will do that will hopefully track the science here and will be scalable and progressively increased, has made it a more propitious place for negotiations to occur. So we see a situation in Paris where, and we'll talk about whether this agreement is sufficient or not, but where we can't really anticipate the train wreck that occurred in Copenhagen, where the parties essentially walked away from the forum.
Thomas, let me ask you to address that perspective that Will just offered in Europe. One might think with the years upon years of flat economic growth, weak economic growth, austerity facing European publics and governments, there might be an inclination to move away from restrictive carbon emissions policies and more ones that emphasize growth without recognition of the consequences. Have we seen that, or have we not seen that?
We actually did see that. You see that with the difference between the 2020 objective, so it was the objective of the European Union for 2020, and recently, actually last year, the EU passed a 2030 package. And the ambitions in terms of the development of renewables and energy efficiency, let's say, were not as big as expected. So basically, if you look at renewables, the objective for 2020 is to have 20% of the European energy mix coming from renewables. And for 2030, it's only 27%. So let's say that it's still going towards the same direction, but at a way, way slower pace.
So you're saying the governmental and public support for a robust, muscular policy on restricting emissions is not there, or is weakened, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, it is weakened, but actually it is also due to quite a misunderstanding about what the energy transition is. There still is this idea in Europe, and actually in many other countries, that the energy transition is costly, which is, at least in my opinion, a confusion between what a cost is and what an investment is. And the point that was underlined by Will Burns is actually very crucial, the fact that the price of renewable is getting down a lot. And we see that especially in Germany. If you look at photovoltaic in Germany, the cost has been divided by 5 over the past 5 years. So the cost of photovoltaic, so solar energy to produce electricity, has been divided by 5 over the past 5 years, and that is a game changer, and that is going to continue. And if you look at the German situation. So Germany has a very ambitious national policy called Energiewende, which means energy transition in a way. And what you see in northern Germany, when there is a lot of wind power that is already installed, today, 50% of the German electricity in the north of Germany is coming from renewables.
15%.
Half of it.
Oh, half.
Yeah, it's 48% to be exact, if you want to be accurate, and they expect 50% next year.
But Germany has also made a dramatic move away from nuclear power or investments in nuclear power. One would think that's counterintuitive if the idea was to reduce carbon emissions. Won't that make it more difficult for Germany to meet its goals?
Yes and no. In the short term, it makes it more difficult, absolutely, because it means that instead of phasing out old coal power plants, they first prioritize the phasing out of nuclear power plants. However, if you look at the medium to long term, the medium to long term objective is to have almost 100% renewables. And when you have renewables in the grid, you need to have flexibility. You need to be able to respond when there is too much wind or not enough wind, too much sun, not enough sun. And if you want to have flexibility in the grid, then nuclear is not actually the best option. Nuclear is a low-cost, low-carbon technology, but it is also something that is not flexible at all.
I see. Michael, let me turn to you and ask. It used to be that in framing this discussion as a public policy issue, people seem to be faced with the choice of growth, full employment, getting my life better, or environmental regulation, which would damage all of those things. Has the atmosphere changed to the extent that people are no longer framing it in those terms and willing to embrace, let's say, a more complex reality? Or do they still see themselves as maybe having to make that choice?
So I think here, that builds on something Will was starting saying earlier, right? Climate negotiations in the 90s were generally seen as, what do we need to stop doing, right? What kind of sacrifices do we have to make? With the growth of a clean technology industry, especially renewables, that changes, because now it's not only about counting the number of losers, but it's also about counting those who can gain from different kind of regulations. And so the frame has to some degree shifted here from something where it's about the sacrifices to distributive effects of new treaties. That will be more among people that have a direct interest in these problems. When you look at public opinion, it's still hard exactly to see how people frame the issue, how they perceive these issues. And you can also see when you look at different kind of messages you give people, when you tell them it's about gaining green jobs or it's about hurting the economy because it's going to reduce the amount of coal and increase energy prices, people are still very responsive to that. So that the framing here can still, it hasn't really, it can change, but it hasn't really created fixed positions.
Well, that's a good segue into a question I would like to ask Leah, since that's what you've studied. I don't see you on the videos today. You are. And you've studied and written on this issue about how people perceive and react to environmental issues. Can you fill us in? Have people begun to see, for example, the benefits? Are they persuaded by these job claims enough to put aside their fears of negative change?
Yeah, so a colleague and myself have been running a number of survey experiments, which Michael was sort of alluding to, which is when you give people slightly different phrasing and you see how that affects their support for something like renewable energy or climate change. And what we found is actually that framing doesn't move people nearly as much as ideology, by which I mean there's been a partisan sorting around climate change and renewable energy over the past 5 years in particular. Some people think it's related to An Inconvenient Truth, the documentary by Al Gore, a very prominent Democratic person saying climate change is real, it's happening now, we need to do something about it. And so you really have seen that People in the United States who identify as very conservative or Republican are increasingly don't believe in climate change or don't support renewable energy. While in the past, particularly for renewable energy and solar, I used to call it like apple pie. It was just widely loved by everybody. You would get 90% support and above, which is insane. You don't really see that for any kind of public policy issue. That said, I've also looked at NIMBYism, which is when people nearby renewable energy, in my case, wind energy, they don't like these turbines oftentimes. What do? And what I found is that even when you have extremely high public support for renewable energy, as several panelists have talked about, you can have local and vocal minorities who can thwart the will of the majority. And I think that that creates significant barriers to the happy story we've been telling about the reducing costs of renewables and actually implementing those technologies in communities. So I looked at this in Ontario, Canada, but you also see it in Massachusetts, in Ohio, in many US states, and you see it in the EU. You see it in the Netherlands particularly, which is sort of funny. You'd think that's a place of windmills, but there's huge resistance to wind turbines in Scotland, in the UK, and in the Netherlands. So how we actually implement these policies, even if the public broadly writ supports them, which they do, but people in sort of a local area who get to elect a local mayor, who get to elect a local parliamentarian, if they don't like the policy, they can often thwart the will of the majority. So that creates significant problems for implementing climate policy in people's backyards.
I would say that if publics, vocal and local, as you say, in Massachusetts and the Netherlands turn out to be obstacles to supporting renewables, we're in a lot worse shape than we thought.
That's what I'm saying, exactly. It is harder than we think.
You would expect to find that support.
And when you think about it, you know, what has been happening in the past few days is there's been a fight over 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 at the climate talks. And it's funny, I find this sort of ridiculous, no offense to the activists who are really feeling passionately about saving, you know, small island states. And I support that, but just because we say 1.5 degrees C doesn't mean we actually get there. And the big part of the issue is going to be implementation. And the fact is, a year ago, the World Bank issued a report that we've already done 1.5 degrees C. So I find it a little hard to believe that just because the international community writes down maybe we might try to do 1.5 degrees C, that we're actually going to do that. I think focusing a lot more on implementation and getting technology in people's communities is really the critical issue.
Indeed, if we were supposed to hit 2 degrees by the year 2100, we've already used up, as I understand it, more than half of that quota, which means for the next 85 years, we can't see a growth of less than a degree. It's not likely to happen. Mm-hmm. Let me switch we'll come back, I think, to the public level, but let me switch to the politics at the global level. That is the issue one of the issues that has been a difficult one for these negotiations to deal with, which is the divide between industrialized, or as they're referred to in the documents, developed countries, and poorer, less developed or developing countries. The former who see themselves as who have already accomplished what they wanted in their development goals and now might be ready to make some changes. And the latter, India, China, Brazil, resistant to that because they see it as a brake on their growth, which the developed countries have already achieved. Have we, and I cast this to any of the panelists who want to address it, have we moved beyond that? Do we see evidence that these negotiations have overcome that fundamental divide? Will?
I would say yes and no. You
belong in my department, Will.
Exactly. What we have seen is language in the agreement that's being developed, acknowledging that all parties need to be making contributions toward reducing emissions. At the same time, what we've seen is language that talks about different national circumstances and stages of development. Redolent of the common but differentiated responsibilities language that we've seen in the past. What we've seen in the commitments that countries have made or intended commitments prior to Paris in many ways reflects a dual track between developed countries and developing countries. If you look at countries such as China and India, for example, the first and third largest emitters, respectively, of greenhouse gas emissions, you've seen commitments to reduce the intensity of their systems, meaning the amount of emissions per each additional dollar of gross national product, which doesn't translate into an actual net reduction in emissions, but slows down the rate of increase of emissions, and a vague commitment on the part of China to peak at 2030, but not clear what level. And so I think you have reached a point where developing countries, especially large contributors, have acknowledged a need to be part of the mix and to take on some kinds of commitments, but commitments that are much lower than those of many developed countries. Problematic given the burgeoning emissions of countries such as China and India, and also freighted with a lot of conditionalities in terms of receiving funding, for example, for their mitigation initiatives that may or may not be forthcoming. So it's a mixed bag.
Michael.
Yeah, no, so just to follow up on this, because the notion of common but differentiated responsibility has been around for at least 1992 in Rio. That was already a core part of the discussion, and it's one which is both ethical and also in terms of the bargaining, right? Because it's also a bargaining chip that countries can use. This being said, I will also say that it seems to me that at least large developing countries, again China, their position, I mean their perspective has to some degree changed when we think about the negotiations in 1997 compared to now. Because if we think, for instance, again, of renewables, and we always come back to renewables, right? Exports of photovoltaic systems from China to the rest of the world is about a market that is now between $30 and $40 billion a year. Right? So that's a constituency that wasn't there in '97. These were people who didn't have much to, that didn't exist, right? So in terms of a internal lobby in these countries, they were not there. And now that creates opportunities to create deals that are focusing more in terms of investments. Still, cutting down is still very hard to sell for everybody, but in terms of investing, and as Leo was saying, in terms of implementing new technologies, that situation has a bit changed.
Thomas. Oh, yes, Thomas. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first, I don't know if I can come back to some point that were made by Leah about acceptance of renewables. Yeah. So while I would agree actually with everything that was said, I just want to point out that there are solutions to enhance the acceptance of renewables. And for instance, windmills particularly are well accepted in Germany. And one of the reasons for that is that the people who own renewable capacity production are the people themselves and local communities. In Germany, you see that half of the renewables that have been installed are owned by either individuals, groups of individuals, or cities, councils, etc. So it makes the thing more acceptable because you own it. So that was the first element. And the second is they're already adapting, for instance, windmills to meet the requirements from locals. One of the things that people actually complain about is the very small red light that you see during the night. That is to deal with basically avoid that helicopters or airplanes actually collapse with windmills. And so they develop a technology that's basically using a radar system that allows the light to function only 3% of the time. So with these technical and political and economic solutions, you can really deal with acceptance of renewables and bridge the gap, as the German example exemplifies. Then, answering your question on developing countries, I would actually link that to the debate on the 1.5 degrees. One of the big things that you see currently in Paris is there is this so-called High Ambitions Alliance. That is an alliance that brings EU member states. And let me point out that some EU member states are de facto developing countries. You take countries like Bulgaria. Bulgaria is poorer than Malaysia. So you have EU member states, you have the US, now you have Brazil that just joined, I think, yesterday. And you've got a lot of developing countries, including the small islands. And what you see here is one thing the EU and the US needed to give to those developing countries was the 1.5 target. So there is a politics behind it, and that is the way to take developing countries on board with EU-US, rather than having developing countries being on board with India and China that are, let's say, more reluctant to an ambitious deal.
Leah, you had your hand up.
So I suppose I would like to go back to this issue of acceptance, and then I'd really like to talk about India and China. So in terms of acceptance, of course, I agree with what Thomas is saying. This is something that we can deal with, and Germany is a great example of a more successful case. But my point was that there are many examples of not as successful cases of renewable energy acceptance. And when we hold up Germany all the time in the Energy Wende, we neglect to understand the dynamics happening in other communities. And I think also the arrow doesn't just magically point the other direction. In Ontario, for example, where you've tried to install on the order of 10,000 wind turbines, just changing a light isn't going to lead to acceptance. And I agree that there probably could have been a better policy where there was community benefits agreements and sharing, but they didn't do that. And so what they did is actually put a freeze on wind turbines so that there's no new wind turbines being put in at all in Ontario. And that's a problem. So I think the way policies are designed and the way technology is designed has lasting effects. You saw that with solar hot water heating technology. It was done a lot in the 1980s. It was really bad. And the consequence is that people don't really install solar hot water anymore in the United States because it leaked everywhere and people got this vision that the technology was bad. Even when today, solar hot water is a lot better than solar photovoltaics, and we never talk about that. So I think that there is consequences to bad public policy, and that changes public opinion for a long period of time. So that's my concern, that it's not going to be as simple as we think.
Before
and I
we
just
get
finished.
Before we get
sorry,
to
you want to
India and
talk more
China.
about backlash?
Yeah. Before we get to India and China, which
Yes.
we will, I want to stay with this subject for one more minute, based on something that Will referred to and that you see in the documents. And let me put it in a blunt and somewhat contentious way. Given this division and the need to accommodate into common groups, and given the fact that developed countries are rich, and by definition the developing countries are not, can the world, in the form of developed countries fund, can they buy their way out of this? Can they transfer enough money to developing countries where the growth in India, China, Brazil, of course, are, as we've mentioned, the largest polluters in gross terms, though not per capita terms. Is there enough money to go around to install either new technologies, defer old technologies, or have those countries make a difference? Is there
that's the technological optimism you're seeing when Bill Gates and a bunch of other very wealthy people in the lead up to Paris announced that they're going to give a lot of money and they're going to fund these early stage, breakthrough technologies. And you see this also with the commitment several years ago in the negotiations to give, I think it's $100 billion a year. And then this has led to this whole discussion with India saying, well, where's the money? Where's the money? That money's supposed to flow from the private sector, according to the OECD. And then developing countries say, well, what about the public sector, which is, I think, more what you were saying. And the problem is, look at the politics in the United States. The Congress is not going to agree to sending money overseas. I mean, they already think the UN is some kind of international government. So I don't think that the public will is there for the developed world to buy their way out of the issue.
Okay, I think I find that unarguable. I can't imagine the citizens of Pennsylvania, for example, voting to raise their taxes by 0.5% so the money can go to help India develop wind power. But let's just put that aside for the moment, and let me focus on you for a moment. I'm going to exploit my colleague. If the money were there, is it enough to make a difference? How do we know that it won't simply fuel, pardon the pun, more emission-producing growth?
So there are two things, right? Is first of all, and that's what Leo was saying, is that even if the money's here, implementation is still the problem. That's the first part. And he alluded to the case of Ontario. My own work is more in India, and you can see that when people have had bad experiences with renewable energy, when their solar company did not come to fix it, that creates a bad precedent, and people then just don't trust it anymore. Right? And so money here is only going to get you so far. The other thing is that it will also rely on technological improvement. And that's one of the flip side of switching from talking about reduction of greenhouse gases, where you're just saying we want 5% less than before, and that was what we tried to do mostly in Kyoto, to something where it's more about how much money you're going to put in, and then we can control that. We can make a promise about how many millions we'll give, but we cannot promise much in terms of what the result will be, right? And so that will be one of the trade-offs, because the second one, saying how much money you will put in, is something that is still easier to sell politically than say you're not going to be allowed to drive, right? But it's one whose result is not necessarily as certain.
Right. Will, let me come back to you, because Michael points to a good point, that the argument pushing new technologies, new jobs, and you've seen these reports about how many new jobs are being created by new, different, non-polluting technologies. And I wonder if those are credible, or are they just another form of overselling, which when people discover the truth, they'll be just as angry as they were at their solar water heater company. They won't believe the claims and will lose all opportunity to get support.
Right. Well, I think there's credible evidence that there's job growth, and there's lots of co-benefits in terms of moving to these technologies, in terms of reduced losses of job hours, health costs, et cetera. One of the challenges in that context, in making the case for renewables, is being able to capture those externalities and cost them out. And when one tries to engage in a cost-benefit analysis in terms of fossil fuels versus renewables, that's one of the problems that we often have, is that it's difficult to quantify those benefits, and very easy to quantify the potential losses of jobs, et cetera, in the coal sector or the oil sector. But I also think that even if one can make the case in terms of job growth, you still have an extremely wicked political problem here, right? Especially in places like the United States. The reality is that we have somewhere between 25 and 27 trillion dollars of fossil fuel resources still sitting in the ground, and those are proven reserves, right? And in order to not pass that 2 degrees Celsius threshold, we have to leave somewhere between 75 and 80% of that in the ground. So that has to become a stranded asset, right? And so if you're the fossil fuel industry, it's easy to do the math. What will you provide in terms of input into the political process to save $27 trillion in assets? And so that kind of political battle remains extremely difficult. The renewable industry has certainly become much stronger from a political standpoint as its market penetration is increased, but it's still extremely daunting. And there's hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies that we still provide to the fossil fuel industry, which further undermines our ability to reach price parity and a competitive environment. And then that won't go away anytime soon.
When I drive from New York to Pittsburgh along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, among the billboards I see is one that says, "Sun sets, wind dies, but coal is eternal." and as you probably know, Pennsylvania is the Saudi Arabia of shale gas. And so it is a dead easy loser for any politician to suggest leaving those assets in the ground and the jobs that they bring with them all over the state of Pennsylvania. I can't imagine how they would square that particular circle. Which I'm going to come back to the issue of, and you've raised all of you have raised so many good issues, but I'm going to come back to the issue of national pledges. And also, I want to flag for a few minutes down the road a point you just made, Will, about subsidies. Because I was just looking at the draft agreement, and I didn't see anything in there about even a rhetorical pledge to end those. But before we get to that, I promised Leah we would talk about India and China, and I'm a person of my word, and I want to make good on that. So don't tell me you've studied public opinion in China on the energy issue, but if you have, that's okay too.
We just finished a paper. Hopefully it'll come out in a good journal. We have R&R looking at India and China. And I actually went to several rounds of the Mercury Treaty negotiations, which is the Minamata Convention finalized 2 years ago. It's the most recent environmental treaty that we have. And I think what we saw in those negotiations, which helps us see more clearly the differences that have emerged in the climate negotiations, is that China and India have really diverged. We have always talked about the developed and the developing countries. This is because we come up with Annex 1 countries and Annex 2 or various annexes. The point is there's a difference between these two things, common but differentiated responsibilities. And actually what I think we've seen is a really large shift in that India and China are no longer cooperating. And just like we might say the EU and the US historically have diverged and they have different interests and negotiating positions, you start to see that within the developing world. They no longer seem to think that being in a really big coalition is going to serve their interests because their underlying interests have shifted. And why is that? Well, we often say, developing countries are poor, but as Thomas sort of implied, there's a huge variation in developing countries. And China is actually 2 times as wealthy on a per capita basis as India. And, Michael knows this a lot because he works in India. India is very poor. Secondly, China is almost entirely electrified. They have already built their coal assets versus India still has 25% of its population with no electricity assets. So in other words, they have to build more coal plants to get these people to even have electricity in the first instance. So I think that when you look at the bilateral negotiations that were happening between China and the US in the last year leading up to Paris, you saw a lot more goodwill on the side of China and serious commitments to say they're going to peak coal, they're going to start an emissions trading scheme. I think it was 2017, really soon. I mean, that's as ambitious in my view as what the United States is doing or what Europe is doing. China is really committing to this. And in part, to tie back to this public opinion, it's because air pollution is seen by the Chinese regime as the largest threat. Environmental problems generally are the largest threat to regime stability. So I think China is actually very willing to tackle this issue versus India has been extremely reluctant. Apart from the personal relationship that Modi appears to have with Obama, there's been basically very little movement on India. And they keep bringing up this issue of, well, where's that $100 billion? They really want money from the developed world. And I think China is increasingly giving money to the developing world. They're actually becoming a donor. So I think we need to think more clearly about how the developing world is starting to fracture within the negotiations. And I hope this will actually lead us to have better outcomes, that we might have more ambitious agreements at the end of the day, because China, largest emitter, is actually starting to say, okay, we'll do something about this.
Thomas, let me follow up on that, especially the very last point that Leah made, that China is now searching for goodwill. It's on the side of the angels. It has pledged this and that. But China is, after all, an authoritarian country with a closed, controlled media. It censors the internet. And how will the outside world, much less its own citizens, other than breathing the air, know that they are making progress on or keeping the very pledges they have made?
Well, that's actually one part of the negotiations at COP21 is basically how are we going to be able to track progress and to make sure that promises actually are actually delivered. So we don't know that yet, obviously. What you have, however, recently was a study published in Nature, and what you saw was that But I'll say there was a good news and a bad news. The bad news was that China underestimated its coal consumption. And what is actually surprising is when you look at coal consumption data in China, you have two sources. The first one is the one from the, let's call it the federal government, and the second one from the provinces of the states. And if you do the sum of the provinces, you don't get the same number. And there's a big difference. So even within China itself, they disagree on how much coal they consume. However, what is interesting is that the coal they use in China is, physically speaking, different from the one that is, for instance, used in the US. And 1 ton of coal in China actually produced less emissions than 1 ton of coal in the US. So what this study actually said was that China's emissions have been overestimated during the past years. So because of this, China may have an interest in having a clear, transparent, let's say, study, because you can actually end up discovering that for physical and chemical reasons, China emitted less than we thought.
I see. So you use in a sense, you use the outside world to validate your claims and give them legitimacy, especially if there might be mistrust over your such claims.
Yeah.
At this point in the proceedings, I always like to give an opportunity to those who are joining us from remote locations other than our panelists, specifically the class at FIU and the class at Illinois. If anyone there would like to ask a question, please make a wild gesticulation and we will turn the microphone on. FIU, yes. Please speak up.
Okay, hi, my name is Claire. I'm an international relations undergrad student. I wanted to ask Leah what you think about how cultural values tie into the perceptions of climate change, in the sense, do the people in Ontario, I didn't quite understand what you said, do the people in Ontario resist the windmills because of how bulky they are, or is it because there's something underlying in their culture that says this is not okay for change, for example? Is change a negative value in their culture? In the sense, to what extent does culture tie into how open people are going to be to windmills?
Terrific question. Leah, did you
It's
get
a hard question, my gosh. Well, I'm not a sociologist or an anthropologist. I'm just a lowly political scientist. So it's a little bit of a challenging question. But that's a really good question. My understanding, looking at the anti-wind publications that Ontario puts out, which isn't that different from looking at what Ohio groups would do or Massachusetts, there's a lot of anti-wind in the Northeast in general, is that they don't like how they change the rural landscape. You know, a lot of people like to live in agricultural areas and they don't want these big, tall turbines that go up several stories in their neighborhood. They then say, you know, these kill birds. They also believe to a certain extent that they create an illness called wind turbine syndrome, which is not documented by medical science, but basically is this idea that they're, you know, maybe give people headaches or make them dizzy. And there's actually 200 symptoms, which is why it's not an actual illness, because when you have an actual illness, there's not 200 symptoms. So people are projecting their dread, their fear, their loss of this rural aesthetic onto these wind turbines. And you'll see that when you do studies, you know, based on people's belief about these turbines, they'll either think they're really beautiful or they'll really hate them. And there's these interesting studies from Australia where there's also huge anti-wind groups that say that when you sort of talk to your neighbor and you say, hey, I don't like those wind turbines, they're making me sick, that the belief that they're making you sick spreads like an illness would spread, but it's spreading through ideas, through the mind, right? Through people talking to one another. So my point is that it's not just Ontario. I just happen to study Ontario because I'm from there, and it seems the only thing interesting to do is to study Canada. But you see it across the United States, across the developed world. When we try to build these wind turbines, there is resistance in certain areas. And I think it might be related, like Thomas said, to community benefits. So if we gave people money to stick these things in their backyard, they probably would like them more. Maybe if we had a more consensus-based agreement process, they might like them more. So I don't think it's necessarily values or cultural specific to a place like Ontario. I think it has more to do with the way that we approach these communities and the way we try to get buy-in from a policy perspective. And that if we did that in more intelligent ways, we might see less of a backlash. I don't know though. I got to do a study on that, Thomas. We don't know necessarily that community benefits agreements are going to work.
Well, it certainly is, from a political science point of view, it's an interesting question, I suppose a classic question, as to whether people oppose it for the specific phenomena of what they're observing, like the little red lights in the sky, which I must say is kind of hilarious, to what you called an ideological position, which is they begin by being conservative, resistant, fearful of change, uncertain of anything proposed by a liberal Democrat. That leads them to conclude that, therefore, they're opposed to it, even if they might not be. It's a fundamental challenge, it seems to me, for democratic systems which have to impose this. Which leads me to my next question. I'm going to come back to you, Will, and it's a point that you made and Michael also emphasized, which is that these negotiations began from the bottom up, as opposed to a regime top down. Here, everybody do this. Instead, 160 or 170 countries proposed a plan. And now they're being charged, essentially, if I read the agreement correctly, with making good on their plan. So my question to you, Will, is will we do better with this method in the next 10 years than we did in the past? But if these are pledges, they're just pledges. If Republicans take over in this country, well, then those pledges aren't worth anything. And that's just the United States. You know, if the red light in the sky contingent takes over in Germany, they'll undo it as well. Should we put any faith in these pledges?
Well, I think that it's a difficult question. It's clear at this stage that what we tried to do in Kyoto, where Kyoto had quote unquote legally binding commitments, didn't necessarily get us to where we needed to be. We had a number of countries that were not able to comply with those, or chose not to comply with those emissions reductions. And in many ways that undermines the legitimacy of the international regime. By taking this approach, arguably countries have less pressure and may be willing to take more chances, may be willing to engage in innovative approaches that they might not have if they were risking violation of a strictly binding international agreement. And so that may be beneficial. The other thing is that I think a lot of countries have taken on pledges that largely reflect what is happening on the ground in their countries. And so it may be that these pledges are not terribly ambitious as a consequence, but a couple of things may happen. First of all, as these countries do take on these commitments and they do go down the path of increased renewable energy penetration, energy efficiency, they may find through economies of scale that costs of compliance are much lower than they anticipated. It may fuel technological innovation that again feeds back into that system, and that may result in substantial over-compliance. So we've seen this in the past in the United States in terms of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, where countries had actually legally binding commitments to reduce emissions. As they began to do so, they discovered that it was much cheaper to do it than they anticipated, and there was a substantial uptick in compliance beyond what was actually required as a consequence. And that may be what we see here. Also, we have a system that, at least the agreement as we see it now in the draft, emphasizes transparency, emphasizes reporting. There will be pressure, moral suasion exerted on countries to do more if it's clear that we're going to pass critical thresholds. And that that shouldn't be underestimated in terms of placing pressure on countries to take on more ambitious commitments in the future. But I think either system, one in which you have legally binding commitments that countries may simply choose not to comply with, as we often saw with Kyoto, or more of a bottom-up voluntary program, are going to be largely dictated by what happens in the market and what happens in terms of the costs of alternatives.
If I look at the most recent draft, Article 6 of the Annex, and as you all know, items that are in contention are bracketed. And on this issue of funds, Article 6, Paragraph 1 says, developed countries shall provide, brackets, new, brackets, adequate, brackets, predictable, brackets, accessible, brackets, sustained, brackets, scaled up. In other words, resources to assist in developing countries. So they can't seem to agree on even, you might say, a rhetorical commitment, much less, no, they do in the next paragraph indicate $100 billion. Although I take your point that some of this will come from private. It's not clear how much. Let me turn to you, Michael, and ask, it's easy to make fun of this, as I just did. Is that about what we've seen? Is that something that will not prevent effective cooperation? And I want to raise also the question I raised, that I posed earlier, was what if there's not cooperation in other crucial areas of policy? Refugees, response to terrorism, response to Russia. Will that hurt the capacity of the developed countries, who after all now have this huge responsibility to act collectively?
So my sense here is the following, is that Will was saying, it will depend a lot on what happens in the market. I would rephrase that and say it will really depend on, most of the action happens at the national level right now.
Right.
And we've seen, Kyoto was, in some sense, as good as it gets in terms of legal requirements to do something, and that hasn't really exactly worked out, right? So most of the action really will depend on what happens at the national level, and that in turn will depend on the who is elected, what their preferences are, what the preferences are of their constituencies. Because you were opening today by saying politicians are short-term, are live in the short run, right? But not necessarily if their constituencies, if their voters have some preferences for the long run, right? You can force policymakers to have better policies. What is important here is that what I just said does not really depend on a treaty. It depends on what elected or unelected officials actually want. Right? And so it's not necessarily clear to me that the fear of cooperation is actually that, or fear of cheating or reneging on treaties is that much of the main problem. I think what is really critical is what will happen at the nation level. And that then raises the question about, well, then why do we need a treaty in the first place, right? And I'm not necessarily sure that the most important part will be about these legal requirements, but will be also about what is really going to be important is coordination of what should happen. It's coordination of policies, because if, for instance, we have some countries that really push for in research and development, that's coordinating their efforts in improving that and reducing the costs that Will was alluding to. And so a treaty is not only about giving obligation, but it's also about planning what the next steps will be. And I think that part is going to be really important, actually.
Thomas, yes.
Yeah, I just want to bring a nuance to what was said on the importance of national elections. While I do fully agree on the fact that decisions will be taken at the national, business, European, local level, national elections, I imagine, do matter a lot in the US in this case, but not that much in Europe, because there is a wider consensus in Europe between mainstream political parties and even extreme right parties in Europe think climate change is a real thing. It is something that needs to be dealt with. For instance, in Germany, you can pretty much take whatever mainstream political party, the energy climate policy will be pretty much the same, and the same goes for the UK, the same goes for Sweden, the same goes for Poland. So national elections in many countries, especially European countries, do not matter that much. What matters is the national consensus and the way you can make politicians understand that the energy transition is actually profitable and that there are actually a lot of things to gain.
Well, let me argue with you a little bit on that. One of the things we have seen in Europe in the last year, and certainly more recently, is a rise of Eurosceptic parties from the right, from the left, their hostility to being told by Brussels what to do. And if these commitments come down, these obligations come down from the EU level, then the opposition to them won't necessarily spring from opposition to particular policies on renewables or emissions, but on the very principle that they're being told by a supranational organization how to make national public policy, which might be resisted. In other words, it would be what you might call a collateral effect of the growth of such parties in Europe. Or is that hysterical? Is that Leah raising her hand? Yes. Go ahead. Oh.
Oh, no, don't pick me. I was just, pick Thomas.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. I always do what I'm told. Thomas.
Well, you're making obviously a good point, but we first need to remember that currently the only legally binding element of the EU policy for climate for 2030 is greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look at renewables and energy efficiency, they are either legally binding at the EU level, either not legally binding at all. And there is no national legally binding target for renewables and for energy efficiency post 2020 in Europe. So currently the situation is, let's say, already with Brussels not really dictating what should be the tools, but only focusing on the objective that is greenhouse gas emissions. And well, yes, you can have in the rhetoric, let's say, some more Eurosceptic positions if some parties win the upcoming elections. But in terms of the policy that will be done, it will, broadly speaking, be the same. And I just want to say that I think there will be much more influence on whether we can, let's say, change the narrative, change the consensus, change the what Gramsci would have called the cultural hegemony on this policy area, then focusing on one particular political party being electing rather than another one, because there is not a big difference of how green parties are in Europe. Green parties aside, obviously, but the left-wing, right-wing cleavage on that is not significant like it is in the US.
To some extent, what comes to mind is the Thomas Risa, Catherine Seeking model of norm creation. That is within human rights is where they use it. It goes to your point about, well, it serves a role by allowing for planning, but it also could serve a role as norm establishment. That is, okay, the 1.5% is hardly reachable, even the 1.5 degrees, even the 2 degrees is not. But put forth as a norm, then it might have an impact on this conversation, on this, what you refer to as cultural hegemony, by establishing as a cultural model renewable energy or reduced emissions, much in the same way that the achievement of gay rights or hostility to the death penalty achieved a kind of prominence and allowed it to be part of a domestic discussion. And I agree that the domestic discussion is clear. Now, is that Leah just fiddling with her ears, or does she really want to say something?
Since I've been disagreeing with him a fair amount, so we're starting to get a bad reputation here. To say that, I agree. Look at what the UK did right before Paris. They said they're going to phase out coal within 10 years. I mean, that's a really big commitment. Think about the history of coal in the United Kingdom, and that's not what the United States is saying right now. Very few jurisdictions have been phasing out coal, Ontario being one of them, though they have already phased out their coal. So I think Thomas is right that there's a consensus within the EU. Is there a global consensus? I'm not so sure about that, particularly when you start to think about costs. Maybe these huge investments in R&D, these moonshot projects or sunshot projects are going to do something about the cost to such an extent that we'll just have India and China leapfrogging, as we say, which means they're not going to invest in coal. They're just going to invest in renewables. We haven't been seeing that yet, though. I don't think we're there yet. So I think the norms only get us so far, particularly for the developing world, particularly for a place like India, where you still have to build so much electricity infrastructure. I mean, the scale of the project, I read a figure that it's the amount of coal that India is going to use, and might I add, extremely inefficient coal. It has very high ash content, is equivalent to opening up a mine every single day. So, unless we change that calculus, and Modi can sort of get up and say, oh, I like Obama, let's be a little bit nicer. But actually, the Indian negotiators, just as they were in the Mercury negotiations, are quite difficult. And Ban Ki-moon and the OECD people are being rather critical and saying, these people are not saying enough. So I'm not sure that norms get us quite far enough. I think there's the real politic, the cost part of it, and I'm just not sure we're there yet. But the UK, I agree. Europe is happy, and they all agree, and they'll lead the way. Hopefully they'll create some huge, innovation, and we'll all decarbonize, and then we'll all be out of a job. We'll have to think about something else to study. So that would be nice.
Well, if that happens, of course, I was going to say you'll hear it first on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, but what I don't want to say is, if that happens, the United States politicians would immediately reject it because we're very suspicious, as you know, of anything that comes from Europe. And so it'd probably be better if it slipped in here in some other way. But I want to stay with the developing world a moment. I realize I'm getting down in the weeds, but I don't want to lose sight of an important issue that affects much more the developing world, especially Brazil and African countries, than it does us, and that is the question of deforestation. So are the developed countries prepared to push and insist that somehow these countries stop burning their forests because, of course, these are important capture zones for CO2, even if, of course, that would be a significant cost to them because, as I understand it, they do that in order to increase farmland, or is that just not a winning issue? I throw this out to the panel to see who wants to tackle deforestation. Is there an equivalent in India where there's something the industrial world is asking them not to do that is typical to Indian development?
I think burn coal is the answer.
Burning coal is right. Well, of course, in the United States, imagine us in the end of the 19th century, the early 20th, if some big power came to us and said, stop burning down or cutting down your forests and stop using coal.
Exactly.
Well, we wouldn't. We did stop using it, however, to continue the metaphor, when other industries grew up, and I'm very sensitive to this in Pittsburgh, that were more efficient than we were. Nobody mandated that all the steel industry in western Pennsylvania disappear, but the market drove it out because the newer plants in Japan and Korea were more efficient, and they essentially went out of business. And I can tell you the air was much better in Pittsburgh than it used to be.
But I can speak to the red issue if nobody else wants to speak to deforestation.
Yes, tell us about REDD, R-E-D-D, right?
Yeah, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation for those students who care, REDD. And then there's a plus at the end of it, which has to do with human rights and making sure that indigenous communities that historically live in the forests, for example, in Brazil and the Amazon, that they have the rights to continue to do so. Because there's sort of two issues at play. There's the industrial scale deforestation problem, and then there's people who just live in the forest and use it for their own purposes and have done that for generations. And why should we say to indigenous communities that they can no longer have subsistence use of the forests? In fact, they might be really good people to protect those forests. So trying to bring them in and use a human rights framework around forest protection is sort of the way that is going. I'm not a huge expert in this, and it appears nobody on our panel is, but I think it's a really key part of particularly the extremely developing countries. So as you mentioned, and Brazil as well. So Africa and Brazil, trying to get those communities on board. And the idea is that we can pay these developing countries for avoiding that deforestation. And that's a way that we can start to think about transferring funds and yet still getting a benefit from it. So that's a little bit similar to the clean development mechanism, which is a way that the developed world can transfer funds to the developing world to avoid creating emissions. And deforestation works on a really similar logic that if you protect these forests, we'll support you with money to do that.
Yes. Will.
There's been efforts to develop the Red Plus program over the course of the last decade under the rubric of the Framework Convention, and that continues. Some of the early stage work that needs to be done is to lay the foundation to establish what the baselines are in terms of emissions. One major challenge is to prevent what we call carbon leakage, i.e., if you compensate people for not chopping down forests, do they simply move to another region in the same country or in another country, chop down the forest, and you get the same amount of emissions, and thus you're compensating people for emissions reductions that aren't actually occurring. That's a major challenge. The social justice issues that Leah talked about are also a huge challenge. It's easy for us to say that we have to acknowledge them. It's a big difference to say that we're going to avoid the kind of land grabs that we may be seeing as people try to capitalize on this, and how we protect the interests of those that are living in these forests. And so we're in preliminary stages to develop those kind of protocols and the kind of information that we need to proceed. But it's unclear, and it's unclear at the end of the day if the amount of money that can be generated to compensate people for foregoing alternatives will be sufficient. When we look at burgeoning demand for food, for example, and the benefits that one gets from clearing forests for agricultural uses, you're going to need a substantial amount of money and a substantial compensatory mechanism to facilitate that. And it's far from clear yet whether we'll be able to do that.
I would think also it'll be a pretty hard sell to ask people to forego their traditional forest clearing while people in Germany are not asked to put up with a red light in their night sky. It seems like this, which allows me to make the point that most of us realize, of course, is that both the costs and to some extent the benefits of climate change are differentially distributed. Those who are better off, if you're worried about your shore property in New Jersey and you're well off, you can simply move maybe to Pittsburgh. But we don't take refugees, so that's not possible. Thomas, yes. Is your microphone on, Thomas?
Yeah. Do you hear me well?
There we go.
Okay, very good. One of the paradoxes, actually, let's say, if you consider that Europe is maybe the most pro-climate continent in the world, at least currently, it is also the one that will be the least affected by climate change. So you've got this surprise. And within Europe itself, the most pro-climate, pro-renewables countries are the Northern Europeans that would actually benefit from climate change. If you are living in Denmark and Sweden, well, assuming nobody will come to those countries as climate refugees, which is a big issue, those countries will get cooler winters, more farmland, etc. And so you have this paradox. It's actually the countries that are benefiting from climate change that are fighting against it because they understand what's at stake.
Right. And of course, these decisions are made to some extent collectively. And I think the point Leah made at the very beginning, and I love the term, so I'm almost certain to plagiarize it, is the local and vocal. That is, that small groups, and we know this in political science, with high intensity of preferences can thwart action or make action go in a different direction, either because they're involved and effective, or preemptively because parties are opposed. Now, I'm not going to let this panel off the hook. I once heard a very wise man say that every time I get an urge to make a prediction, I lie down until it passes. Which I can't quote it. It might have been me that said it, but we are in the middle of these negotiations. We're apparently at the end. The Paris group will come up with something presumably by tomorrow. And I'd like to ask each of the panelists. I'm going to start with Michael, my colleague, and to say what they think this agreement will offer and what its fate might be, so that if we have a session like this again in a couple of years, what can we expect? So I'm going to put you on the spot first, and I'm going to get to each of you, of course.
Can I check the updates on the Guardian's website?
Yes, that's right. Get my iPhone.
Well, it changes every minute.
True.
If I had to guess, given the lack of enthusiasm for hard, clear cuts in the short run for at least most developing countries and the US, the EU is probably the most vocal push in favor of these hard cuts, but they will not be able to buy everybody else off. My sense is it will be weak and or distant requirements in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. So either you push them further down in time or you weaken the obligations, and much more attention paid to the structure of how to finance a lower path, a lower trajectory in developing countries in terms of greenhouse gases, how to reduce the intensity, as I think Will was saying, of emissions as these countries will grow, and so spending much more time on that front.
Leah?
I also hate predictions. At the end of this paper that we just finished, one of our peer reviewers said, well, what's going to happen in the future? And me and my co-authors were like, we don't want to say what's going to happen in the future, because then we'll read this paper in 5 years and be horrified by what we wrote. So yes, it's difficult to predict the future, but I would agree. I actually agree with what Michael said, that I don't think we're going to see a really strong agreement. And I don't even necessarily understand what a really strong agreement would look like at the international level. Maybe I've become a cynic after watching year after year after year of these COPs. We're at COP 21, if I have the number right. And I'm not sure what the international process gets us, except for this planning function, this normative function. So I think the nice thing about it is that it provides this time that countries say, hey, we're going to turn off our coal plants in the case of the UK, or in the lead up to it, the bilateral negotiations between China and the US, we're going to peak our coal. So what I think we're going to start to see is some commitments, maybe some updating. The COP process will grind along, but maybe we're going to start to move to more bilateral negotiations, particularly between the largest emitters. Because I think what's happened is, as China has become the largest emitter, and then the US, and then the EU as a whole is really big as well, the EU has already said they're going to do something. So who's left at the table? It's the US, China, and India in terms of growth in particular, because I think India is only 7% of global emissions right now. So it's the issue with India is that its future emissions are going to be large. I think we're going to start to move towards more bilateral negotiations between the US and China and India, and hopefully towards more technology sharing, so that, as Michael was saying, we see leapfrogging in India. That's an optimistic forecast, though. I'm not sure we're necessarily going to see that. I hope so, though.
That's why you live in California.
Yes. Well, we have the drought here, you may recall. That's a climate effect. And we're about to have the largest El Nino on record. I'm pretty excited, actually. But it's going to cause flooding and, bridges to be washed out. It's going to be costly. So, yes, climate change definitely affects California.
Will?
At the end of the day, the agreement itself will be fairly weak. I think they're probably going to use the language that we've seen in one of the drafts of trying to peak, quote unquote, as soon as possible, and then to rapidly decrease emissions thereafter. The reality is if you look at the INDCs, the pledges that were made prior to this, that may or may not be legally baked into the agreement, you actually see a substantial increase in emissions from now, right? That's the dirty little secret, right? We're at about 47 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions now. If all of the commitments are met, we go up to somewhere around 58 or 59 by 2030, and we get temperature increases of probably somewhere between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius. So what I think the agreement will facilitate in a way that hasn't happened before is transparency of reporting of emissions and this stock taking provision that requires us to look at whether we're on a trajectory to meet the 2 degrees Celsius or whatever agreement is ultimately reached or not. But the bad news is that if the agreement stands as it is, that first stock taking doesn't take place till 2023, and that would necessitate even deeper annual cuts in emissions than if we were to start immediately and acknowledge that we need to bend the curve of the INDCs even further. So I think it will be critical that funding for adaptation to live in a world of 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius is forthcoming, and that the loss and damage provisions, the sense that we need to both reduce losses and damages and provide some kind of compensation for inevitable loss and damage that will occur as a consequence of temperature increases of that sort are forthcoming. But it's far from clear at this point in Paris how those issues are going to be handled.
Well, speaking of Paris, it's appropriate that we end with Thomas, because you can give us up to the minute reports on what is happening there, and we await your perspective on the most recent texts.
Yeah. My personal opinion is actually what will matter the most is not the text itself, but the way it's going to be perceived by national decision makers, by business leaders, etc., and citizens also. So it's rather a matter of perceptions. I would say that what happens a few days after the agreement gets disclosed will be as important as what is happening now. So how are we going to frame COP21 outcome? To me, the real question that is asked to world leaders at COP21 in Paris is not really to save the world, because they can't do that, politicians. What they can do, however, is to send signals, whether to speed up or to slow down the energy transition that has already started. We already have more renewables. We already have more energy efficiency. Are you going to send signal to speed this up or not? So that's the real question. So what I think we can do is actually to go into the text when it's decided and look for those signals that can be used to say, hey guys, and by guys I mean us, citizens, businesses, national decision makers, what are you going to do to speed up the energy transition that was, let's say, supported by the Paris Agreement, hopefully. And maybe to end on a positive note, what is currently occurring in Europe is maybe the beginning of an energy efficiency revolution. If you look at the level of energy consumption in Europe, it has been decreasing steadily since 2010. And now today, Europe consumes about 8% less energy than it did in 2010, while we actually had growth since 2010. So what you see there is going in a very good direction. Just to give you an idea, the consumption that was saved in Europe through energy efficiency during only those 5 last years is about the energy consumption of a country like Italy. And this was done with limited legislative framework, limited financial involvement. So maybe that's something where Europe and some American states can really lead the way to have new technologies, but new processes, new behaviors that are far more energy efficient. And then we can live in a world where everybody will have access to energy, but to, let's say, a lot of energy services, like a lot of heating, a lot of cooling, but with little energy consumption and therefore a very small impact on the environment.
Well, I really like that last sentence, because it takes a topic which in many respects, if you spend too much time on it, can be very depressing. Yeah. But you've ended on an optimistic note, which I very much appreciate. I especially appreciate your interventions, Thomas and Leah and Will and my colleague Michael. I hope you've all benefited from this. The recording of this should be posted pretty soon. I thank you all for your attendance and participation, and we'll regather in January.
Thank you.
Thank you.